Hello there, I'm Thundaga, and welcome to my How to Make a Pokemon Game tutorial series. This series will cover all of the essential info you need to make a Pokemon game in RPG Maker and Pokemon Essentials. In this episode, we'll be looking at adding new Pokemon to our game. First, we'll cover all the assets that are required for a new Pokemon, from graphic files to sound effects. After that, we'll look into where Pokemon data is defined in the various Pokemon PBS files. Then, we'll look at how we can use the Debug menu to assist with editing Pokemon data. After that, we'll add our own new custom Pokemon to our Essentials project, and then we'll even encounter it in the wild and catch it. With all that said, let's get into it. So, every Pokemon in Pokemon Essentials has some assets that determine how they look and sound in-game. There are a lot of graphic files, from battle sprites and icons, to some more optional files like overworld sprites or footprints for the Pokedex. There's also an audio file for each Pokemon's cry. Pokemon Cries live inside of the Audio SE Cries folder. Cries are pretty straightforward, since these are just OGG audio files named after their corresponding Pokemon. Cries can also be set up for different forms of Pokemon. We'll do a deep dive on forms in another tutorial, but as a teaser of what's to come, here's what Shaymin's default cry and Shaymin's Form 1 cry sound like. And that's it for Pokemon Cries. Now, let's look into where the Pokemon graphics live. Inside of the Graphics and then Pokemon folder, we can see all of the subfolders for most of the Pokemon graphic assets. These are each important in their own way, but let's cover them in order of importance, starting with Battle Sprites. Inside of the Front folder is where you will find the front sprites for all the Pokemon, with the image file named after the corresponding Pokemon. Front sprites are what we see when battling against this Pokemon, as well as in the party screen and Pokedex and so on. Most of these sprites are 160 by 160 pixels, though some larger Pokemon sprites are 192 by 192 pixels, and they all have a pixel density of 2. What I mean by that is that each little square that makes up the sprite is really a 2 by 2 pixel square. Ideally, the Pokemon is centered in the image, since their position in the battle screen is instead driven by some other data that we'll cover in a few. There are also additional sprites here for Pokemon forms, Pokemon genders, and shadow Pokemon. A good example of Pokemon forms would be Deoxys, where the default is Form 0, and then we can see Forms 1, 2, and 3 here as well, for the attack, defense, and speed forms respectively. The key is that the end of the file name contains the identifier, so Deoxys_1 means Deoxys Form 1, and so on. A good example for Pokemon gendered sprites is Hippowdon, where the female sprite is defined separately and the default is the male sprite. An example for shadow sprites is Electabuzz, which comes with a shadow sprite by default in Pokemon Essentials. It's not the greatest looking sprite since it's just a purple overlay, but it gets the job done. You could always go crazy though and add some different shadow sprites, such as a Shadow Lugia if you wanted. Next up is the Front Shiny folder. This is exactly the same as the front folder, but for our Pokemon's shiny sprites. After that is the Back folder. Back sprites are what we see when battling using this Pokemon. As the name suggests, this is the Pokemon's back, usually facing up and right to look at the enemy. These are also 160 by 160 pixels, and the Pokemon should be aligned with the bottom of the frame. They also tend to take up most of the image space and feature the Pokemon being cut off on the bottom, since you don't tend to see the whole body in a Pokemon's back sprite. Just like the other sprites, back sprites can have forms, be gendered, or be shadow as well. And finally, there's the Back Shiny folder for shiny back sprites. That's pretty straightforward, right? If any of the shiny sprites are missing, then the default sprite will be used instead. If any of the default sprites are missing, then a placeholder question mark sprite will be used instead. Next up are the Icons sprites. These are what show for Pokemon in the party menu. Each icon sprite is 128 by 64 pixels, with 2 frames of animation, each frame being a 64 by 64 sprite inside the image. These typically just bounce up and down a little and have some minor differences in pose. Like the battle sprites, icons have forms and shadows, but no gendered differences. If no icon graphic is present for the Pokemon, then a default question mark icon will be shown instead. There is also the Icons Shiny folder. As you can see, this is empty by default in Essentials, since the shiny icons are optional. If no shiny icon is present, then that Pokemon's default icon will just be shown instead. There's always that shiny star icon too that symbolizes that the Pokemon is shiny. Next is the Eggs folder. This is where you can add custom egg sprites if you want. In base Essentials, there's the default egg that all Pokemon use, as well as the icon and cracks graphics. Cracks are what appear on the egg during the hatching animation and contain 5 different frames for the stages of cracking. There's also one custom egg here for Manaphy, as well as an icon for Manaphy's egg. There are no custom cracks for Manaphy's egg by default, so the standard 000_ cracks will be used when Manaphy's egg hatches. Custom eggs are rarely ever used, but it would be fun to see a game lean into these more somehow. After that is footprints. A footprint is just the small sprite that shows that Pokemon's footprint in the Pokedex. If no sprite for that Pokemon's footprint exists, then that square will just be empty in the Pokedex. Worth mentioning also, a good amount of Pokemon footprints are just an empty sprite because they don't have feet. So for example, Arbok here. And the last folder here is Shadow. This isn't for shadow Pokemon, but rather the shadows that appear underneath an enemy Pokemon as you battle them. There are just 3 shadows of varying size here. We can set which shadow appears underneath each Pokemon later when we review Pokemon metrics. That's it for the graphics Pokemon folder, but there is another place where Pokemon graphics can be commonly used. Inside of the graphics characters folder is where we would place any overworld sprites for our Pokemon. I have one already here for Pikachu. These are optional for the most part, unless you want to lean into a system like following Pokemon or have certain Pokemon appear in the overworld as other events. They follow the same format as the other characters, where they contain 16 different frames. 4 facing down, then 4 facing left, then 4 facing right, and finally 4 facing up. When making an event and then selecting an overworld Pokemon sprite as the event graphic, I would recommend enabling stop animation here in the bottom left. This will make it so that way the Pokemon is animated even when they aren't moving. This makes them look more alive. That's all for Pokemon assets. Now let's look into how Pokemon are defined in the PBS data. Inside of the PBS folder here, if we scroll down a bit, we can find the 3 PBS files that make up a Pokemon's data, which are Pokemon, Pokemon Forms, and Pokemon Metrics. Pokemon is the main one that we'll be looking at, since that's where the majority of the interesting stuff lives. When opening it up, we can see that there's a ton of info here for each Pokemon's definition. We'll go through all of the different fields here in a second, but first you should know that there's a page on the Essentials Engine wiki that describes each and every value for defining a Pokemon species. This page is super useful, so I'd recommend checking it out. This will be linked in the video description as well. There are a ton of different fields here, as you can see, and some of them are optional or unused by Essentials, so be sure to reference this page whenever you have any questions. Now, let's break down the definition of a Pokemon, such as Pikachu here. First, at the top, we have the Pokemon's ID and name. The ID is in all caps and is what Essentials uses when finding this Pokemon. If you remember, the graphics and cries we looked at earlier were in all caps as well to match the Pokemon ID. These IDs must be unique. Underneath that, for the name, this is what will display in-game, so this doesn't need to be in all caps. The name and the ID don't need to match, but for organizational purposes, it's a good idea. Next are the Pokemon types. We can define a Pokemon with 1 type or 2 types separated by a comma. So, for example, if I do comma, ground. When choosing a type here, we need to make sure it's in all caps because this is using a type ID. If we run the game and compile this data, we'll see this change reflected in-game, where our Pikachu is now electric ground type. Let's undo this though, and then let's move on to the next section. The next section is base stats. These are the 6 Pokemon stat values that determine their growth, separated by commas. In order from left to right, these are health, attack, defense, speed, special attack, and special defense. It's probably obvious, but stronger Pokemon will have higher base stat total values. Next is gender ratio. This determines how frequently the Pokemon will be assigned a gender. You can go with genderless, always male, always female, or female of varying percentages, such as female 50%. I'd say you should reference the wiki page here though, because only 5 different percentages are actually supported. Next is the Pokemon's growth rate, which determines the rate at which they gain levels by setting the experience required for them to level up. These are fast, medium, slow, parabolic, erratic, and fluctuating. I mostly stick to fast, medium, and slow though. After that is base experience, which affects how much EXP we get for beating this Pokemon in battle. There's a formula that calculates the XP earned and takes the Pokemon's level into account, as well as base EXP. The default value is 100, and Pikachu here gives us a little bit more at 112. A Pokemon like Blissey though has a base XP of up to 635. Now that is a lot of experience. Next is EVs. This is just what effort values we gain from beating this Pokemon, as well as how many. As we can see here, when we beat a Pikachu, we get 2 speed EVs. It is possible to define multiple as well. For example, Ivysaur here grants 1 special attack EV and 1 special defense EV. After that is catch rate. This is a value from 0 to 255 that determines how easy the Pokemon is to capture. A low value means that they're harder to catch, and a high value, such as 255, means that they're incredibly easy to catch. Since Pikachu has a value of 190, it's generally easier to catch. Next up is happiness. This is just the base happiness value that this Pokemon will have when caught. It's a value from 0 to 255, and as we can see here, Pikachu starts off with 50. After that are abilities and hidden abilities. When setting an ability or a hidden ability, make sure it's in all caps, because here we're using ability IDs. Pokemon will always have at least one ability, but they can have two, separated by a comma. Pokemon can also have a hidden ability defined, though this is optional. As we can see here, Pikachu has Lightning Rod. Some Pokemon, such as Gengar, only have one ability and no hidden abilities. If you want to see all of the abilities and their IDs, then open up the Abilities PBS file. Next are moves. These are all the IDs of moves that this Pokemon learns when leveling up, as well as the level that they learn in front of the move, separated by a comma. Level 1 means that this move is known by default at level 1, and level 0 means that the move is learned after evolving. If we scroll down here and look at Raichu, we can see that Raichu has level 0 for Thunder Punch. If our Pikachu ever evolves into a Raichu, then it'll learn Thunder Punch during evolution. Underneath moves are tutor moves. Tutor moves are the pool of moves that this Pokemon can learn through TMs and HMs, as well as move tutors. The tutor moves also draw from the moves above, so don't worry about writing down any moves twice. After that are the optional egg moves. These really only apply to the unevolved Pokemon that can come from eggs, so for example, Pichu here. These are the moves that the Pokemon can only learn as an egg, obtainable through breeding. Speaking of Pokemon eggs and breeding, the next two fields are egg groups and hatch steps. Egg groups are the categories that the Pokemon can breed with. There can be multiple egg groups defined here as well, separated by a comma. These don't need to be in all caps, by the way. There's also the category Ditto for Ditto, which can breed with everything. If the egg group category is ever set to undiscovered, then that Pokemon cannot breed. Hatch steps are just how many steps it takes for an egg of this Pokemon to hatch. It can be any number, 1 or higher, though most Pokemon have this set to at least a couple thousand. There are a couple optional fields as well for breeding, such as Incense and Offspring, but for more info on those, I'll say you should check out the wiki. I don't know too much when it comes to Pokemon breeding stuff, and they can explain it much better than I can. Next up are a couple fields that are really just for the Pokedex. Height and weight are that Pokemon's height and weight. I know, pretty crazy. Height is in meters and weight is in kilograms, though, funnily enough, if the game detects that the player is in the USA, then it'll show the height in feet and inches, and the weight in pounds instead. That's kind of funny. There are also color and shape, which must be set from a select pool of available colors and shapes. You should check the wiki for the full list of colors and shapes. These are mainly just for searching in the Pokedex. After that is habitat. This must also be set from the pool of available habitats found on the wiki. This isn't really used for anything in Essentials though, so I'd say don't worry about this one too much. If you ever want to define a new habitat, this can be done in the scripts. In the hard-coded data section of the scripts here is the habitat script, and inside we can scroll down and we can see where and how all of these different habitats are defined. We can also see that there are other scripts for hard-coded data for some of the other fields that we covered earlier, such as body color, body shape, egg group, gender ratio, and growth rate. If you ever want to define your own of these, or just look into these some more and see how they're all defined, then I would totally recommend that you look into each of these scripts. You can even look and see how different evolutions are defined, or stats, or natures, or different statuses. There's a lot of really interesting stuff here that you can dive into if you're curious and want to check out some of the scripts. As a heads up, if you ever decide that you want to add a new body shape, then you should make sure that you also update the icon shapes graphics file, since this contains all of the icons that show for the shape when using the Pokedex search. This file lives inside of the Graphics UI Pokedex folder. Next is category. This is a short descriptive title for that Pokemon. For example, Pikachu's category is mouse. When looking at Pikachu in the Pokedex, Pikachu is displayed as the mouse Pokemon. After that is the Pokedex entry for the Pokemon. This is just all the text for their Dex entry, pretty self-explanatory. If you ever want to edit this, just be careful that it's not too long. Next up is generation. This is unused in Essentials and is mostly just helpful for organization. As we can see here, Pikachu is generation 1. Since generation is unused though, we could set generation to any value we want, such as 0, or we could just delete it entirely and things would still work out just fine. Now we have an interesting one that's optional but used by certain Pokemon, which is flags. I haven't used these much, but they can do some cool things. There are flags for legendary, mythical, and ultra beast Pokemon, which make their AI smarter. You can also do stuff with forms, such as the default form with flags, or the ability to inherit from that Pokemon's mother, for example, Burmy. There's also a flag to pass the form down if the Pokemon is holding an Everstone, for example, Obstagoon passing down Form 1. All the info related to flags can also be found on the wiki. After that are the optional wild item fields. We can set wild item common, wild item uncommon, and wild item rare. Right now, Pikachu just has wild item uncommon, and that's the light ball. Common is a 50% chance for the Pokemon to be holding that item in wild encounters, uncommon is a 5% chance, and rare is a 1% chance. If all three are defined and they all are set to the same item, then the chance for that item will be 100% instead. And once again, these are optional. If they're ever unset, like if we just delete them all, then the Pokemon just won't hold any items during wild encounters. Let's undo that though, so that way Pikachu at the very least has wild item uncommon. There we go. Now last, but certainly not least, we have evolutions. These are how we set what Pokemon can evolve into, as well as how they evolve. As we can see here, Pikachu evolves into a Raichu by item use, if that item is a Thunderstone. Most Pokemon tend to evolve by level, so for example, Bulbasaur here evolves into an Ivysaur at level 16. There are many more evolution methods though, so I would recommend combing through the list of Pokemon and searching for any that you know evolve in unique ways. As we can see here, Pichu evolves via happiness, so that's not too crazy unique. But as we can see here, Tyrogue has its own evolution methods defined for attack greater for Hitmonlee at level 20, defense greater for Hitmonchan at level 20, and attack defense equal for Hitmontop at level 20. That's pretty unique. There's a full list of these on the wiki as well, so be certain to reference that if you're interested in updating any evolutions to use new methods. And that's it for the Pokemon PBS file. That sure was a lot of info, huh? We're not done yet though. There's a little bit more for us to look into for forms and metrics. Those are gonna go by a lot quicker though. Pokemon Forms contains the PBS data that'll be changed or overridden for each Pokemon's form. At the top here are some Mega Evolutions, so we can see things like the form name being Mega Venusaur and there being a Mega Stone required. Scrolling down though, we can see definitions for some other forms, such as Galarian Zigzagoon being Form 1 here. The general rule of forms is that they all use the base data from the Form 0 Pokemon, unless anything new is defined here, which will then override it. Since Galarian Zigzagoon doesn't have any base stats defined, it'll have the same stats as a standard Zigzagoon. We'll do a full deep dive on how to set forms up in their own tutorial though, later. Just know that this PBS file is where form differences are defined. Lastly, we have Pokemon metrics. This is what determines a Pokemon's positioning and shadow in battle. We can see there are X and Y coordinates for the Pokemon's back sprite as well as their front sprite, since they each need to be adjusted individually. There's also the Shadow X, which controls the horizontal position of the shadow under the Pokemon, and then there's the shadow size. We could try messing with these values here in this dock, but there's a much better way to position our battlers, and that's with the Debug menu. In the Debug menu, if we go to the PBS File Editors option and then scroll down and select Edit Pokemon Metrics, then we can use the Sprite Positioner tool. Here, we can select a Pokemon and edit their metrics. We can even edit them for each form. Since Abomasnow is on top of the alphabetized list here, let's select them and then edit their metrics. If we use Set Ally Position, we can then use the arrow keys and change the position of the back sprite. At any time, we can hit Enter and lock in the new metrics. At any time while we're editing, if we don't like the change, we can hit Back or Escape to revert those metric changes. If we select Set Enemy Position, then we can move around the enemy battler position for their front sprite. For testing purposes, let's just slide them a little bit to the left here, and then let's hit Enter to lock that in. Next, we can use Set Shadow Size to choose from None for no shadow, or a size 1 shadow that's small, and then a size 2 shadow that's medium, and then a size 3 shadow that's large. Abomasnow is kind of a big Pokemon, so let's keep that at Shadow Size 3. Next, what we can do is set shadow position. Since we slid our Abomasnow sprite to the left, let's also slide our shadow over here to the left. Then let's hit enter to lock that in. The last option here is auto position sprites, but I would recommend that you don't do that because that can sometimes cause issues. What auto position sprites does is it tries to align the front and back sprites to a generally optimal position by snapping them down. This will move the back sprite so it rests along the top of this red box here, and it will move the front sprite so that way its bottom pixel is touching the center of the battle base. It doesn't center the sprites though. To show you what I mean, here's what happens when I select auto position sprites after moving Abomasnow way up and out of the way. When I select it here, boom, it just snaps them downwards, but it doesn't center them. This can cause issues for flying Pokemon such as Aerodactyl though, because you'd want them floating above the battle base instead of resting directly on top of it, so auto position sprites doesn't really work here. Anyway, now that we've made some changes and we like these new values where they're at, let's hit escape a couple more times to leave the menu. Now it'll prompt us to save the changes. Let's hit yes because we do want to save these changes. If we open up the PBS file again, it should say it's been modified by another program, and then we can hit yes to reload the changes. Looking at Abomasnow here, we can see our changes have been made in the dock, where the front sprite is now moved to the left a bit, so it's -11 and 9, and then the shadow X is -11 here. So that's pretty great. The sprite positioner tool is very convenient, and I would highly recommend using that instead of going into this document here and manually making little changes. I mentioned it earlier when talking about the auto position, but just as a heads up, in the debug menu, there's also this auto set Pokemon metrics option, but I would recommend that you do not use this. It has the potential to mess up a lot of Pokemon positioning and metrics, particularly for Pokemon that float above the ground, so I would say just steer clear of this. From the debug menu, it is also possible to go in and edit individual Pokemon PBS information, but I find this to be a little bit awkward and prefer working within the text document. That's a little bit easier for me personally. Now, let's take everything that we've learned and add our own new custom Pokemon to the game. What we'll need are graphics, audio, and some PBS changes to get them in the game, and then after that, we'll add them as a wild encounter. And I've got an idea for a funny Pokemon that we could add. I've gone ahead and made some sprites for this weird new Pokemon species that we could call Cam. Cam has 2 back sprites, one for standard and then one for shiny, 2 front sprites, an icon sprite, and a cry. Let's go ahead and plug these into their proper folders while making sure that they all have the correct name, which should just be Cam, C-A-M in all caps. Okay, I've plugged in all the sprites where they need to go, and I've added the Cry to the Cries folder here. Now, let's add Cam to the Pokemon PBS. I think as a baseline, we could just copy Pikachu's PBS data for Cam, since Cam really ought to also be an electric type. Let's copy it all, including the divider above, and then hit Ctrl-C here, and then let's scroll all the way down to the bottom of the file, go in, and paste. We need to make some changes though. First and foremost, we need to make sure that the ID is Cam in all caps there, and the name is Cam here as well. We can also increase the catch rate, so Cam is 255, very easy to catch. I'll also change up the Pokédex entry here so it makes more sense for Cam. Perfect, there we go. And screw it, let's make it so that way Cam also evolves into Raichu when a Thunderstone is used. Now we can go into our Encounters PBS and add Cam as a wild encounter. Right now our Route 2 map only has a Pikachu, but we can just change that so instead we'll run into a Cam. Now let's run our game with playtest and hold the left control key on our keyboard so it compiles all the PBS data. Now that we're in game, there's one more thing that we should do, which is open the debug menu, and then go to Player Options, and then in Toggle Pokédex, make sure we give ourselves the National Pokédex. Since Cam hasn't been added to any of the regional Pokédexes, such as the Kanto Pokédex, we won't see any info when we catch it, unless we have the National Pokédex. And look at this, a wild Cam, wow, level 6 too. Interesting. This is gonna be a pretty good Pokemon that we should catch. I've heard that they're pretty rare too. Let's throw a quick ball at this Cam and see if we can catch him. I'm keeping my fingers crossed though. Come on, baby. Yes! We caught that wild Cam. Yes! I've been looking for a new electric type to add to my team. Beautiful. Let's read this Pokédex entry.
Cam, how's it going?
Wow. Fantastic. It's a work of art. Alright. Let's not give him a nickname though. Let's see how they look in the party, by the way. Let's go to our party. Oh yeah, look at that icon. That icon sprite is fantastic.
Cam, how's it going?
Hey, there we go. So we've got ourselves a beautiful new Pokemon. And as you can see, it's not that hard to define and make new Pokemon in Pokemon Essentials. And that does it for this tutorial on adding new Pokémon. I hope you feel more comfortable when it comes to editing the Pokémon that currently exist in Pokémon Essentials, as well as adding your own new Pokémon. I really appreciate it when fan games add new Pokémon, especially if those Pokémon are designed by talented artists. Art is hard though, so don't feel like your game needs new Pokémon to be good. Anyway, thank you so much again for watching. If you learned something from this tutorial, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you come up with any of your own cool new Pokémon designs, I'd love to see them. To access my tutorial website, please check the link in the video description. As a reminder, this tutorial was for Pokémon Essentials version 21.1, so in the future, it's possible that the layout of some things could be changed. In general though, this series should get you where you need to go when it comes to making your own Pokémon fan game. Thank you so much again for watching, I hope you learned something, and I hope you have a good one. Best of luck to you in your Pokémon fan game endeavors. Bye now!